The controversy over the burial of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos at the Libingan ng mga Bayani, the final resting place of many of the Filipino nation's presidents, veterans, artists, and other cultural figures, raises a number of questions. Above all, whether it is even just in the first place, given how many Filipinos Marcos and his regime were responsible for killing. But because it is fundamentally about defining Marcos's significance in his time and ours, I would regard it ultimately as a question of history. President Duterte justified the move by stating that Marcos deserved to be buried at the Libingan ng mga Bayani because he was both a veteran and a former head of state. Quote, "There is only dalawa lang, and ang problema niyan, he fit on both counts, soldier and or president ka." Thus said the president as he tried to downplay the gravity of his actions. Let's examine both of these claims. Let's look at the history. Throughout his political life, Marcos repeatedly claimed that he was a heroic fighter against the Japanese during World War II as part of a special unit called the Maharlika, the Noble Warriors. And because no one fact-checked him, many of his critics were put to death during his dictatorship, this myth persisted. Then, in 1986, historian Alfred McCoy, then working on a book about Filipinos in World War II, discovered that, in fact, Marcos had at least greatly exaggerated his claims or, at worst, had been lying outright. This was a finding McCoy reported to the New York Times. McCoy also found that there was no evidence to back up Marcos's claims. And to the extent that he did contribute to the war effort, as one report that McCoy found put it, Marcos's activities in wartime were, quote, "of limited military value," end quote. Duterte, unconcerned about the truth, has repeated these falsehoods. Marcos's name, he says, quote, "appears on the record. It was recognized. He even had a valor medal for his deeds," end quote. In fact, these too were a fabrication. Marcos likely earned no such medals. What if the president's claim that he deserved to be buried in the Libingan ng mga Bayani simply because Marcos was president? Now, on the face of it, this was certainly true. At first. Marcos was twice voted into office by the Filipino people in free elections, first in 1965 and again in 1969. Yet what came after his elections undid all of his efforts as an elected politician, his declaration of martial law on September 21st, 1972. Viewers of Kababayan Today are no strangers to the human cost, the horrors of Marcos' subsequent regime of dictatorship. And we should listen closely to the voices of activists who survived and those who did not, because they sacrificed themselves for the cause of democracy in the Philippines. Marcos, in contrast with them, sacrificed democracy in the Philippines itself. After he became president, he proceeded to destroy the institution of the presidency. Why should this fact be celebrated rather than mourned? So, according to the terms President Duterte himself sets out, then, Marcos should be disqualified from burial in the Libingan ng mga Bayani. What these examples show is that history, for Marcos, and apparently no less for Duterte himself, isn't about representing the truth of the past. Instead, it is about creating myths and falsehoods that justify the undemocratic power of murderous regimes. Maybe, in this way, Marcos' new resting place makes perfect sense. His life was built upon falsehoods and myths. Why then shouldn't his legacy be so too?